Welcome back to the U.S. Navy History Podcast. I am Dale and I'm joined by Krista.
Hello, everyone. So glad that you're here again.
So today we're going somewhere most people don't expect when they think about World War I. Forget the muddy trenches of the Western Front. Forget the frozen wastes of the Eastern Front. We're heading to the Namib Desert.
What? That is not a place. You're right. I don't think about that place at all during World War I.
It's a vast, arid strip of land along the southwestern coast of Africa, where the Atlantic Ocean pounds against miles of sand dunes, and the sun can boil the life out of an army before a shot is even fired.
I think that's foreshadowing, if I'm not mistaken.
This is the story of the Southwest African Campaign. It's a campaign that began in 1914 and ended in July 1915, when forces of the Union of South Africa, fighting as part of the British Empire, wrestled control of German Southwest Africa from the Kaiser's colonial troops. Now, if you're picturing camel cavalry and endless sandstorms, you're partly right. But the truth, as often more than not, is more complex. And far more connected to naval history than the romantic desert image suggests. In 1914, as you well know, the First World War exploded across Europe. But the battle lines didn't stay in Europe for long. The colonial empires of Britain, France, and Germany meant that war spread quickly to Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. And in the far southwest of Africa, the German Empire held a colony that would prove both a strategic asset and a potential naval thorn in Britain's side. German Southwest Africa, modern-day Namibia, wasn't just an empty desert. It had deep water ports like Luderitz and Schakopmund. Radio transmitters capable of communicating with German warships in the South Atlantic. And, most critically, it sat right next to Walvis Bay, a South African port already under British control. If left in German hands, these ports could serve as supply bases for German naval raiders, especially the feared commerce-raiding cruisers that prowled the Atlantic early in the war. For the Royal Navy, keeping the South Atlantic safe for shipping was non-negotiable. And for the Union of South Africa, the campaign was about more than just imperial duty. It was about securing its own borders and asserting itself as a power in the region. But here's where it gets even more interesting. South Africa's campaign didn't start with ships landing troops on enemy beaches. It started with internal rebellion. A group of disaffected Afrikaners, known as the Maritz Rebellion, rose up against the South African government, motivated in part by pro-German sympathies left over from the Boer War. This internal unrest forced Prime Minister...
Let's see. Prime Minister... I don't remember who the Prime Minister was during this time. I'm going to say not Winston Churchill, because I know that's right.
General Louis Botha.
Yeah, doesn't sound like it's Winston Churchill, so I'm going to score that as a W for old Christoph.
And his right-hand man, Jan Smuts. They were forced to split their attention, quelling rebellion at home while planning a complex desert offensive abroad. And make no mistake, this was not an easy theater of war. The Nambi Desert is one of the oldest deserts on Earth. Rainfall is almost non-existent.
Whoa.
Water sources are scattered and unreliable. There are no rivers to speak of in the central and northern regions. Temperatures swing from blistering heat by day to near freezing at night. For an army in 1914, this wasn't just uncomfortable, it was deadly. March too far without resupply, and your horses collapse. Run short on water, and you might lose more men to thirst than to bullets. Every mile of advance required careful coordination between railway construction crews, camel supply columns, and most importantly, naval transport ships that could keep coastal supply bases stocked with food, ammunition, and fresh troops.
Yeah, we saw how helpful that was in the Middle East campaign with the Great Britain effort. I mean, those were the key elements there, and they were very successful.
Yeah. So the answer to that question that you pretty much just posed in a different way, of being why is a desert campaign in Africa a subject for us as naval history, right? Simple. This campaign could not have been fought or won without maritime control. South African troops landed at Luderitz and Schwarzkopmund under the protection of Allied warships. Supplies arrived by sea. Communications were maintained via naval wireless stations. Even the final push inland depended on coastal ports being secure. In short, this is another case study in how sea power enables land power, even in a campaign fought hundreds of miles from the nearest major naval battle. So over the show, we're going to walk through the twists and turns of this short but fascinating campaign. We'll talk about the rebellion that almost derailed it before it began, the rapid coastal advances, the daring armored car raids, and the final surrender of German forces at Korab in July 1915. We'll also examine the strategic aftermath, how South Africa's victory here cemented its role as a British Dominion power, and how the lessons of supply, mobility, and sea-land integration echoed into later campaigns. So, grab your map, picture the burning sands of Nambi on one side and the cold Atlantic swells on the other, and let's step into a theater of war where naval control didn't just matter, it decided the outcome. Are you ready to get underway?
I certainly am. Let's do it.
Before we talk about South African troops landing at coastal ports or armored cars tearing across the desert, we need to understand a simple fact. In late 1914, the Union of South Africa was not united. It had been barely 12 years since the end of the Second Boer War.
Oh, that's right.
Bitter, bloody conflict between the British Empire and the two independent Boer republics, the South African Republic and the Orange Free State. The war had left deep scars. Boer farmers were burned. Boer farms were burned.
Ooh.
Civilians had been interned in British concentration camps, and thousands of Africans had been displaced. Even though the British won, the peace settlement allowed for some degree of African political influence. By 1914, the Union of South Africa was a governing dominion within the British Empire.
Hmm.
But that didn't mean all the wounds were healed, or that loyalty to London ran deep in every heart. Many Africans still resented British authority. And when the First World War broke out, a number of them saw Germany not as an enemy, but as a potential ally against British imperial rule.
Yeah. Enemy of my enemy is my friend, right?
Mm-hmm. In September 1914, just as the Union government was preparing to invade German Southwest Africa, a faction of pro-German Africans rose in open revolt. This uprising would be remembered as the Maritz Rebellion, named after one of its key leaders.
Mr. Moritz, I presume?
You're half right.
Okay.
Lieutenant Colonel
Oh.
Mani Moritz.
How dare I say Mr. when he's a lieutenant colonel?
Yeah. Yeah, he might have some words.
I'm sure he would.
Moritz had a complex history. He had fought against the British during the Boer War and later served in the Union Defense Force. When war with Germany came, he was ordered to take command of forces on the border with German Southwest Africa. Instead of following orders, Moritz slipped across the frontier, made contact with German authorities, and then returned to his men to declare that he was joining the Germans in their fight against Britain.
Whoa.
And Moritz was not alone. Other prominent figures like Christian Bayers, a former commandant general of the Union Defense Force, and Couz de la Rey, a Boer war hero, were sympathetic to the cause. Some wanted independence for South Africa. Others simply saw a chance to settle old scores. The rebels' goals were straightforward in theory, but as always ambitious in scope. 1. Overthrow the pro-British Union government. 2. Declare the restoration of the old republics. 3. Ally with Germany, which would in turn help secure their independence after the war. The Germans, for their part, were happy to encourage any disruption to British operations.
I bet they were.
They supplied the rebels with weapons, ammunition, and promises of support. Though how much actual aid they could provide from the desert colony was questionable. Prime Minister...
You just said it. It sounded Dutch. What was that? Hans Brisa.
General Louis Botha.
That's right.
And Defense Minister...
Oh, I don't even go there. I don't know. I just...
Jan
Smuts.
No, Jan
Smuts. That's right, because I was thinking of a smut shop. Not too deeply, but just as an association to remember the dude's name. But then, my mental defenses popped up. It's like, don't think about that during the podcast. So I couldn't remember the name. And I think that's fair.
Well, now I think that just boosted the rating for this show.
Well, word association. That's how you remember names.
Well, they both moved quickly. Botha himself was a former Boer general.
Mm-hmm.
He had fought against the British, but since 1910, he had taken the role of national leader. He believed in reconciliation. But he also knew that rebellion during wartime could not be tolerated.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of delegating the suppression of the uprising, Botha personally led Union forces against the rebels. This was more than a military decision. It was political theater. Botha was showing Africans that loyalty to the Union didn't mean surrendering their heritage, but it did mean honoring their new place in the world. By mid-October 1914, government troops began moving against rebel positions in the Orange Free State and Transvaal. Fighting was sporadic but decisive. Several rebel leaders were killed or captured. Coustelare was shot dead at a police roadblock, an event that became both a rallying cry for the rebels and a symbol of the futility of the uprising. By early November, the rebellion was crumbling. Botha used a combination of military pressure and political amnesty to encourage surrenders. Those who laid down their arms were often spared the harshest punishments, though a few leaders, Moritz among them, fled into German territory. This quick suppression of the rebellion had two critical effects. One, it freed the Union Defense Force to focus entirely on the invasion of German Southwest Africa. Without victory at home, an overseas campaign would have been impossible.
Mm-hmm.
Two, it demonstrated that South Africa could handle internal crises without direct British intervention. For a young Dominion, this was an important display of self-reliance. So even while the rebellion was being put down, the war on the frontier had already begun. The first significant engagement came in September 1914 at the Battle of Saint-Fontaine. Union troops advancing from their base at Luderitz pushed inland to confront German colonial forces. But the advance was poorly coordinated. Union forces overextended themselves. Their water supplies ran low, and the Germans, well familiar with desert tactics, used mobility to encircle them. When the shooting stopped, the South Africans were forced into a humiliating retreat. The Battle of Saint-Fontaine was a small fight by global standards, but it was an early warning. Desert warfare was unforgiving. And the Germans, though outnumbered, knew how to use the terrain to their advantage.
I'm very surprised because Germany doesn't really have a lot of deserts, and so for them to be so skilled at desert combat and went against an army that had just finished fighting in that area, right? Like they fought in the Boer War, so you've got a lot of British soldiers there that are veterans and experienced, and yet still the Germans are victorious. That is surprising just on paper.
Well, remember, just like Britain and France and all these other major powers, Germany had colonial interests in other places as well, including in deserts.
Yeah, I guess that's true. And then we see that later in World War II with their North African campaign, very successful in desert terrain. So that, I mean, you got to hand it to the Germans.
Yep. The Germans, if you can call them a lot of things, but being competent at military procedures, that was high for them.
That have a long history, I guess, that predates even the modern state of Germany, like as Prussia and just going back through time. Area had a lot of strong military leadership.
Well, yeah. Before Germany was Germany, Germany was used as a battleground by everybody.
Right. So they got used to fighting.
So the German commander,
Hans Lutz.
Victor Frank.
Victor Frank. That's barely it. Well, okay. Victor Frank. Got it.
He understood his position perfectly. With just a few thousand colonial troops, many of them mounted, he could not hope to stop a full-scale invasion. But his plan was to harass the South Africans, force them to stretch their supply lines, and time for the rebellion in South Africa to gain traction. The longer the Union forces were tied up, the greater the chance Germany could hold its colony until reinforcements, however unlikely, arrived by sea. By December 1914, however, the tide was turning against Germany. The rebellion was over. Union forces were reorganizing. The Royal Navy's control of the South Atlantic meant no German reinforcements could break through the blockade. The stage was now set for the real invasion. A two-pronged advance from the south and west, supported by naval landings at key coastal ports. The Southwest Africa campaign was about to shift gears, moving from scattered skirmishes and political drama to a coordinated, large-scale military operation.
This is exciting. I'm so ignorant of this campaign that everything that you're saying is brand new to me, with the exception of, like, there are colonies in Africa as a result of the scramble for Africa in the late 1800s, and the British conflict in the Boer Wars. I'm familiar with that, but everything else, World War I specific, I have no idea what's about to happen. You did give hints as far as the importance of naval presence and support, and then the harshness of the desert, so that's helping me understand where things are going, but still and then also the modern, oh yeah, who won this ultimate campaign? Yeah, I understand that, so let's continue. I'm excited to hear what happens next.
So by the end of 1914, the rebellion was crushed. Oh. The border skirmishes had played out, and the Union Defense Force could finally turn its attention fully to the campaign across the frontier. But if you're picturing a dramatic cavalry charge straight into the heart of the Namib Desert, you might want to slow that movie reel down. Because before any advance could happen, the campaign had to be planned meticulously, painfully, and with a kind of logistical precision that could make or break an army. And in this case, the real key to success wasn't just boots on the ground. It was ships in the harbor. The Southwest Africa campaign was a textbook beach assault. There were no storming parties leaping into the surf under enemy fire. Instead, the Union of South Africa's war effort depended on something subtler, but equally critical: establishing and holding coastal supply bases. These bases, Luderitz in the south, Swakopmund further north, and a string of smaller anchorages were lifelines. From them, supplies could be brought inland by rail, wagon, and motor transport. But these supplies didn't just appear magically on the dock. Every rifle, every crate of ammunition, every water tank, every bale of hay for the horses, and yes, this is still the time for horses.
Oh, yeah.
Had to come across the sea. The Royal Navy's command of the South Atlantic meant German warships could not contest these shipments. By late 1914, the threat of the powerful German cruiser SMS Königsberg, operating off East Africa, was still in the British mind. But in the Southwest African theaters, the seas were effectively locked down. Without that security, Union forces would have been vulnerable to the kind of commerce raiding that could strand them in the desert without food or ammunition. In other words, the Navy didn't just help win the campaign, it made it possible for it to happen at all.
Wow.
On land, Prime Minister...
Hold on. It's General Louis Botha.
He began mobilizing the Union Defense Force for a multi-pronged invasion. The plan called for 1. A southern advance from the Cape Colony border. 2. A western advance from the 2 German ports names I mentioned earlier that I'm done trying to pronounce. 3. A northern force to move down from Portuguese-controlled Angola. And lastly, an eastern column pressing from the Buchanan Land Protectorate, or modern Botswana. It was an ambitious plan that would require moving thousands of men, hundreds of horses, and tons upon tons of supplies.
Wow.
Not across friendly farmland, but across some of the harshest, driest land on the planet.
Whew.
Here's where the Navy's quiet role comes into focus. Troops embarking from Cape Town, Port Noloth, and Walvis Bay boarded transport ships, often requisitioned civilian vessels refitted for military use. These ships carried not just soldiers, but everything they need to fight and survive. Rail sections and locomotives extended supply lines inland, condensed food supplies to survive long desert hauls, medical stations for heat stroke, dehydration, and the inevitable cases of dysentery, and entire portable water purification plants.
Wow.
Because drinking straight from desert wells was a health hazard in itself. The ships often sailed in small convoys, escorted by warships when necessary. Upon arrival, they'd offload cargo onto piers, sometimes under threat of German coastal guns, though in most cases, the Germans avoided direct naval confrontation. So, Lutherance was seized early in the war with minimal resistance. Its small harbor, though limited, became a hub for the southern advance. We'll call the other one Swak.
All right.
This one was more difficult. The Germans had evacuated the town but destroyed much of its port infrastructure before leaving. Union engineers had to work quickly, rebuild piers, lay new railway lines inland, and restore telegraph connections. Even Walvis Bay, already under British control, saw upgrades, becoming a staging point for operations against the German-held interior. From these ports, engineers built railway spurs deep into the desert. In many cases, these railways were laid directly on the sand, with teams constantly maintaining them against shifting dunes.
Wow.
Water, more precious than ammunition, was piped inland from coastal desalination plants or transported in great canvas tanks mounted on rail flat cars. A typical column moving inland might carry 2 or 3 days' worth of water at most. Any interruption in the supply chain could prove fatal. As the inland columns advanced, naval vessels coordinated with them by ferrying reinforcements and fresh supplies to whichever port was closest to the front. When the inland advance outran one port's capacity, another coastal point would be activated, supplied, and connected to the rail lines. It's the kind of operation where the enemy might never see a battleship, but every rifleman owes his survival to the Navy.
That's incredible.
One of the more innovative parts of this campaign was the use of small-scale amphibious landings to bypass German defenses. In several cases, Union forces landed north of German positions, forcing them to retreat or risk being cut off. Now, these were not large-scale D-Day style assaults, but they were complex in their own right. Timed landings in tidal shallows, coordination between naval gunfire and advancing troops, and rapid establishment of beachhead supply depots.
That is super complex. I mean, I don't see how you do this without any like technology. Like you couldn't have done this in the Napoleonic era, for example. You know what I mean?
Definitely not as easily.
Because radio exists at this point, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
we're about to get into it.
Oh, well, so what a segue. Go ahead.
So naval wireless stations played another vital role. In the desert, messages could be delayed for days if sent by runner or wagon.
Mm-hmm.
Wireless allowed BOFA's headquarters to coordinate with ships offshore, redirecting them as needed to respond to the shifting front. It also meant German positions could be monitored indirectly, intercepting wireless traffic between German units and their commanders. It's tempting to focus on battles, on cavalry charges, artillery duels, and dramatic surrenders. But in the Southwest African campaign, the quiet, unglamorous work of moving crates, building tracks, purifying water, and unloading cargo was what made the victories possible. Every grain sack unloaded, every water tank filled, every crate of ammunition landing. These were the real foundation stones of the campaign. And with the ports secured and the supplies flowing and the columns ready to march, the South African invasion of German Southwest Africa is going to begin in earnest.
That's nuts. I just, how pivotal is the Navy here and railroad and like desalinization, like all these things that you're mentioning that are supporting this entire movement from the West, from the sea. That takes a lot of planning, a lot of engineering. And can you imagine laying track on desert dunes? That sounds like the worst job in the world. I'm sure it's a bunch of privates doing that, or I don't know. I would not want to lay track in the desert in the southwest of Africa. Anyway, this is incredible. I'm sure that based on what you're saying, the troops from the West where you have naval support, you're getting a lot more inroads as opposed to the folks that are coming from the East. I think you said from modern-day Botswana or the North from the Portuguese facilitated, like managed lands. Yeah, this is incredible. And the Germans, although excellent at desert fighting, I'm sure, are meeting their match with this level of coordination. And I'm sure are probably learning lessons for the future.
Oh, yeah. We'll see those in World War II. Mm-hmm. So by the opening weeks of 1915, the South African forces had something every military commander dreams of. Secure supply bases, reliable sea lanes, and the logistical muscle to support a major inland offensive. But here's the thing. Logistics only gets you to the starting line. The real challenge? Turning that coastal advantage into an unstoppable march into the deep interior of German Southwest Africa. And this was not a land that welcomed intruders. The Namib Desert is one of the oldest deserts on Earth. Its sands have been shifting for millions of years. From the coast, it stretches inland for over 100 miles before giving way to rocky plateaus and mountain ranges. To the untrained eye, it looks like a flat, expanse of emptiness. But to those who have to cross it, it's a minefield of natural hazards. Sand dunes that swallow wagons whole.
Ooh.
Salt pans where the ground appears solid, but will bog down men and animals. Scorching days and freezing nights that sap strength. Scarce water holes, many deliberately poisoned or destroyed by retreating German forces. The Germans had no illusions about holding the coast, but they understood the terrain would do much of the fighting for them. General Louis Botha's plan hinged on the multi-pronged advance we touched on earlier. By attacking along several axes, he could force the Germans to split their limited forces and avoid giving them a single target to concentrate against. The main thrust from the coast was led by forces landing at Swakopmund and advancing inland towards Windhoek, the German colonial capital. Another column would push from Luderitz in the south, linking up with the inland forces advancing from the Cape Colony border. Smaller contingents would press from Walvis Bay and the east through Buchanan Land, ensuring the Germans had to defend multiple frontiers. When the Union troops first entered Swakopmund in early January 1915, they found a strange, silent settlement. The Germans had evacuated it, destroying the port facilities and sabotaging the rail lines inland. What they left behind was a shell of a town.
Ooh.
Empty buildings, stripped warehouses, and the looming presence of the desert beyond. For a modern army, this was an inconvenience. For an early 20th century army relying on steam locomotives and horse transport, it was a major problem.
Yeah.
Union engineers went to work immediately, repairing the narrow gauge railway that connected Swakopmund to the interior, clearing sand drifts from the tracks daily, restoring telegraph lines to maintain communication with the coast. Within weeks, it had been transformed from an abandoned outpost into a bustling forward base, with supply trains running regularly inland. Meanwhile, at Ludenritz, the southern column was preparing for its own advance. The terrain here was no friendlier. Rocky outcrops, dry riverbeds, and the relentless heat challenged men and animals alike. One advantage of the southern route was the proximity to the great Namaqualand region, where the terrain, while still arid, offered more predictable water sources than the Nambi's endless sands. The southern drive aimed to converge with the central forces, creating a pincer movement towards the German heartland.
Whoa.
By late January 1915, the columns advancing from the coast began encountering German outposts. These were typically small detachments of the Colonial Defense Force made up of German officers, settler volunteers, and African auxiliaries. The Germans used these outposts for reconnaissance and delay tactics. They would engage briefly, often from well-camouflaged positions, then withdraw before Union forces could bring their full strength to bear. It was classic hit-and-run desert warfare, designed to slow the Union's advance, force them to consume more water and supplies, and time for the main German force to regroup inland. Botha's forces relied heavily on mounted infantry, many of whom were Boer veterans of the 1899-1902 war. These men were skilled riders, accustomed to fighting in harsh conditions, and comfortable operating in dispersed formations. Their mobility allowed them to outflank German positions and cut off retreat routes. However, mounted warfare in the desert came with a cost. Horses needed vast amounts of water and forage, adding further strain to the supply chain.
That is tough. I mean, this sounds like the most inhospitable place. I'm not discounting any of the horrible hell on earth places on the Western Front, but this is just a whole new world. And I was thinking it's 100 miles inland from the coast before you get to Rocky Plateau. So it's like you could say you have a beach house 50 miles inland and you're still technically on the beach because it's sand everywhere. But it's the most inhospitable place in the world. Golly, this takes such coordination. And the Germans really know what their position is. It's like, hey, have these outposts, do what you can, but then get out of there because you don't have resupply, you don't have reinforcement, you have nothing. And you just have to do the best with what you have. And even the horses you do have require so many resources that I can see why motorized transportation later on becomes such a crucial element to desert warfare.
Yeah. So even though the inland fighting was now days away from the coast, the Navy remained critical. Ships delivered steady streams of supplies, which were then loaded onto trains and convoys for the inland push. Whenever possible, the columns tied their major advances with the arrival of fresh shipments at the ports. This meant that the pace of the campaign was, in part, set by shipping schedules and the ability of port workers to unload and forward cargo quickly. Conditions on the march were grueling. Soldiers woke before dawn to take advantage of the cool morning hours, moving steadily until midday heat forced a halt. Afternoons were often spent resting under makeshift shelters, maintaining weapons or tending to the animals. Water discipline was strict. Soldiers were rationed to a set amount per day, and unauthorized drinking could result in severe punishment. The risk of dehydration was constant. The men learned to conserve sweat by moving slowly and keeping as much skin as possible covered.
Really? That's surprising. I mean, I didn't know that it was to that minute detail.
Sand was another enemy. Getting into rifle mechanisms, clogging machine gun belts, and grinding against skin under uniforms. Maintenance was a daily battle. The Germans played on the mental strain of desert warfare. They would leave small signs of their presence, abandoned campfires, a few cartridge cases, tracks in the sand, without showing themselves. The effect was unnerving. Union troops could never be sure how close they were to the enemy or whether they were walking into an ambush. At night, the desert became eerily quiet. Some soldiers reported hearing distant hoofbeats or voices carried on the wind. Phantoms of an enemy always just out of reach. By March 1915, the inland columns were making steady progress. German commander...
Oh, man. Vincent? It did not sound like a German name. Victor Frank?
Victor Frank.
Yes.
He recognized that holding the desert frontier was untenable. His strategy shifted from defending forward positions to concentrating his forces deeper inland, closer to supply centers and more defensible terrain. This meant the Union forces were able to occupy large swaths of territory without major battles. But it also meant that decisive confrontation was still to come.
And they were stretched out all over the place. So having to supply all of that in the brutal desert or even rocky plateau, it would have been very difficult.
Yeah. By the end of this phase, Botha's multi-column advance had 1. Secured the coast, 2. Established functioning supply lines deep into the interior, and 3. Forced the Germans to abandon their outer defenses. But the real fight, the one that would decide the fate of German Southwest Africa, lay ahead. In the rugged highlands and valleys around the colonial capital of Windhoek.
I am very excited to see what happens. I know that just coming into this episode when you were talking about the conflict between the powers involved in World War I and their colonial outposts in Africa, I was like, okay, there's not a lot of... I know Germany has, I think, 2 major holdings in Africa, both in the south. There's German West Africa, which is where we're at here, and then German East Africa, and that's it. But it's sandwiched by all this English territory or British territory. And so I often wonder how this unfolds. And so who gets to control this until their ultimate independence in the next decade or so? Golly, I was looking at a map while you were speaking just to kind of follow along, like the coming into oh gosh, can't even say it. The port on the west, the main one, and how they drove east to the capital. Those cities, as you can imagine, still exist. You can visit them now, and it's a gargantuan distance that they would have to march through without any modern infrastructure, no roads, no rails. They had to provide everything for themselves, and that's just such an effort. I feel better about my day that is ahead of me because I don't have to deal with building a railroad over hundreds of miles of desert to get to an enemy encampment with a constant threat of dehydration, sandstorm, and or enemy ambush. I'm the luckiest man alive.
Well, I did tell you to pull out a map at the beginning.
Yeah,
you did.
I listened.
I'm very proud of you.
You know what? This is how we succeed. You give the orders, I follow the orders. Boom.
All right. So, Windhoek, which I have completely mispronounced, is actually Windhoek.
Oh, okay.
Wasn't just the capital. It was the logistical and communication hub of the entire German colony. From here, telegraph lines radiated out to coastal towns, mining districts, and military outposts. Railways converged here, connecting the highlands to the ports and the interior. For the Germans, losing Windhoek meant losing their ability to coordinate resistance across the colony. For Botha, capturing it would effectively shatter organized German control in the territory. By this stage, Botha's plan had evolved into a massive converging operation. Multiple columns, which had been advancing along separate routes, would now pivot towards Windhoek, aiming to arrive almost simultaneously and cut off any German escape. The main components were the central column, advancing from the coast through Karibib, pushing directly east towards Windhoek. The southern column moving up from Ludenritz and Owls, striking north and east to meet the central forces. The eastern column advancing from Buchanan Land Protectorate, applying pressure from the east, and the northern column pushing down from Portuguese Angola, aiming to block any northern withdrawal. This was a high-risk maneuver. If the columns failed to link up, the Germans could slip between them and prolong the war. Karibib was the key jumping off point for the central columns. Once secured in early May 1915, it proved a functioning railway line towards Windhoek, badly needed for moving supplies forward. Engineers worked around the clock, repairing sabotaged tracks, rebuilding bridges, and clearing debris left by the retreating Germans. From here, the advance gathered pace. Mounted infantry fanned out ahead of the main force, scouting enemy positions and probing for weaknesses. The German commander, Victor Frank, understood that a stand-up fight against superior numbers would be disastrous. Instead, he relied on delaying actions. Skirmishes fought from prepared positions, followed by rapid withdrawals before the Union forces could bring their full firepower to bear. They destroyed wells, burned fodder, and dismantled sections of railway, forcing Botha's forces to slow their march and divert resources to repairs. But this strategy carried its own risk. Each withdrawal ceded more territory, bringing the Germans closer to being completely encircled. Even hundreds of miles from the coast, the Navy's invisible hand was still at work. Fresh supplies continued to arrive at the coastal ports, feeding the railways and wagons trains pushing inland. Naval wireless stations kept Botha informed of convoy arrivals, allowing him to time his advances to coincide with the delivery of food, ammunition, and, most importantly, water. It is worth noting, without a steady stream of coastal resupply, the drive on Windhoek would have bogged down long before reaching the highlands. As the converging columns closed in, the psychological impact on the Germans grew. Reports from captured prisoners indicated that morale was low. Troops were weary from months of marching and constant withdrawal. And many knew that reinforcements from Germany were impossible given the British naval blockade. Civilian populations in the German settlements were also anxious. Many feared reprisals or looting. Although Botha's policy was to maintain discipline among his men and avoid alienating the local inhabitants. By the first week of May, the Union forces were within striking distance of Windhoek. The surrounding terrain offered a mix of open plains and low hills. Good ground for mounted maneuvers, but also favorable to defenders who knew the land. Botha pushed his men hard in the final days of the march. The goal was clear. Reach the outskirts of the city before Frank could mount a concentrated defense or slip away entirely. Faced with encirclement, Frank made a calculated choice. Rather than fight for Windhoek and risk destruction, he decided to preserve his remaining forces by withdrawing further north, into territory where the terrain and distance could work in his favor. This meant that when Botha's leading elements entered the outskirts of Windhoek on May 12, 1915, they found the city largely undefended. The Union forces marched into the capital without major resistance. Union flags were raised over government buildings, and the telegraph office was taken intact. A major intelligence windfall. Civilian administration was placed under military control, with orders to maintain order, protect property, and reassure the local population. The capture of Windhoek was a political as well as a military victory. In London, it was hailed as proof of the Union of South Africa's commitment and capability as a dominion within the British Empire. Despite the triumph, Botha knew the war in Southwest Africa was not yet finished. The German forces were still intact, retreating north towards Otavi and the far reaches of the colony. If left alone, they could regroup and potentially prolong the conflict for months. The final phase of the campaign would see the Union forces pursue the Germans deep into the interior, culminating in confrontation at Utivi and Korab.
So, one of the things that I find most interesting about this campaign by the British forces, primarily undergirded by the South African forces, but also, like you were talking about, the British Navy, and how they were the lifeline that supported this whole push to Windhoek, or Windhoek, however you say it.
Windhoek.
I think one of the key elements in World War I generally is when Germany begins unrestricted submarine warfare. And that's what they just crush on the high seas, because they're all these capital ships that the British have get sunk by submarines, and they're starting to be afraid. It's like, hey, you can't do that. That's not gentlemanly. And it's like, hey, this is war. We're going to do what we're going to do. And I am curious why the Germans did not. I know it's a long distance away, but if they could have sent a fleet of submarines down to this area, it could have secured Southwest Germany, or that territory, because one, they would control the coast, and then two, all the troops that would have been in the interior of this desert would have been cut off, and they would have had gobs of prisoners or casualties. Like the British would have suffered an amazing defeat, and I'm sure Germany had enough on its plate to not worry about this. Like the homeland was, like they were pushing on Paris, they had their own plans, but it seems like they had a weapon that could have undermined this entire process, but it just wasn't employed. And so that's just a curiosity I have why that wasn't done. But golly, the commander of the German forces here did everything he could, I think, with what he had. And that was respectable. Like, he was facing huge numbers, huge supply lines, and using the unforgiving territory in his favor, I think, was the best he can do, and then find better positions to defend from. One thing I'm unsure about is why he let the telegraph office fall in. Like, they were destroying railway up until this point and poisoning wells and subverting the enemy the whole time. But that seems like a huge missed opportunity, because if you can communicate throughout the entire territory, that's another humongous advantage. So I guess it's easy for me, again, over 100 years on, to say, hey, why didn't they do this? But ultimately things played out the way they did, and I think everybody made decisions with limited information, and it unfolded the way it unfolded.
It sure did. By mid-May 1915, the Union Defense Force had achieved what many had doubted possible. They had crossed the desert, taken the capital, and forced the German colonial army into a rapid retreat. But for General Louis Botha, Windhoek was never the end goal. His real aim was to bring down the Schutztruppe to the point where they could no longer fight, and that meant hunting them down before they could regroup in the far north. After abandoning Windhoek, German commander Victor Frank led his men towards the Ovati Highlands, an area of rugged terrain and better water supplies. His hope was that the increased distance from the Union's coastal supply bases, combined with a challenging topography, would slow Botha's pursuit and give the Germans breathing space. It was a sound strategy on paper. But Botha was not content to sit in the capital. He ordered an immediate advance north, coordinating all columns for a closing pincer movement. The Germans would be trapped between converging Union forces and the neutral Portuguese frontier. The march north was one of the fastest of the entire campaign. Mounted infantry, many of them Boer veterans who thrived in mobile warfare, pushed ahead. shadowing the German columns and forcing them to keep moving under constant pressure. Supply lines stretched almost to the breaking point. Railway construction crews worked in shifts around the clock, extending repaired lines as fast as possible, while wagon trains and motor vehicles carried essential rations and ammunition forward. Even this late in the campaign, the Navy still played a critical role. Shipments of supply continue to pour into the ports, where they were transferred to rail lines and overland transport for the final push. In late June and early July, the Union forces made contact with German rear guards in the Otavy region. These were sharp but brief engagements, designed not to destroy the Germans outright, but to harass them, sap their morale, and keep them from digging in. One significant clash occurred near Otavy on July 1st, where Union troops forced a German defensive position, inflicting losses and forcing another withdrawal. This engagement convinced Frank that continued retreat was inevitable. By early July 1915, Botha's converging forces had driven the Germans into the Korab area, a position northeast of Otavy. Here, the Germans found themselves boxed in. Union columns blocked their southern route, and the proximity of the Portuguese frontier limited their maneuvering room. With supplies dwindling, men exhausted, and no prospect for reinforcements, Frank opened negotiations. On July 9th, 1915, at Korab, Frank formally surrendered the German colonial forces to Louis Botha. The terms were generous. The Germans were allowed to retain their personal belongings, and the African troops who had served under them were treated according to established military protocols. In total, more than 3,400 German troops laid down their arms, bringing an end to organized resistance in German Southwest Africa. The surrender marked one of the swiftest and most decisive campaigns of the First World War. In less than 9 months, the Union Defense Force had conquered a territory larger than Germany itself, using a combination of mobility, logistical coordination, and well-timed naval support. For the British Empire, it was a strategic victory that secured the South Atlantic sea lanes and removed a German base of operations from the region. For South Africa, it was a statement of military capability and political loyalty to the Allied cause, though one that came at a cost in lives, resources, and the long-term politics of the region.
I kind of want to read into this more because this is fascinating to me. I know that the goal was to secure the South Atlantic lanes. That was kind of the primary thing, because if you're coming from India and you're England, you want to secure the Suez, which we talked about in a previous episode, and you want to control the Cape of Good Hope, right? The tip of Africa. And so in order to maintain that, you have an enemy power right there that could cut off all that stuff. And so getting them out of the way would be significant. One of the things I'm surprised about, though, is what happened to the German Southeast Africa? They're right there. Were they not under the same attack? Could they not support their West African colleagues? I mean, it's kind of, I think Germany was just stretched so thin and fighting so many battles on so many fronts. This was probably not on the top of their priority list. I can definitely see that.
Well, we're also just starting Africa.
Well, it's 1915 still. We're kind of just into the war. And these are just like the early moves that are securing things for Britain in this case. And they have the Schlieffen Plan that we talked about many episodes ago. That was kind of what they were marching to. It's like, we're sticking to this plan. This is how we achieve victory. And if they're putting all their effort into that, they're not emphasizing other conflicts like this one, where this one could have been beneficial in some capacity, or at least given them some kind of bargaining chip later on. Like if they would have had thousands upon thousands of South African and British troops captured, that's something that they can work with. So again, this kind of gives me more questions to a degree. But one success I will say it's done is it's given me awareness of this conflict and interest in it. Like I want to find out more. Like, hey, what happened? And how does this play into the grander context of World War I and the conflict between the European powers? Fascinating. And I know Belgian Congo is this huge mass a little bit north, and Belgium is what the Germans went through and effectively conquered. Anyway, lots of complexity here, and I now have one additional piece of the puzzle, so thank you. And also, I want to commend the Navy for enabling this whole thing. That was amazing, and it's cool to reflect on their contribution, like internationally. Like clearly this isn't U.S. Navy, but how a strong Navy can enable such an expedition or a conflict. That's just amazing to me.
And like other past conflicts we've covered, they didn't have the learning curve.
That's right, yeah. They were like, oh, we've done something similar to this, even though we're not totally familiar with the geography or the terrain, because clearly the Germans had been there a while, at least 30 years probably, and they had that disadvantage. But what they did have is a motivated force. They knew what resources were necessary, and they were able to transport the relevant people, equipment, and resources, food, weapons, to the front. And as long as that lifeline was there, they could do what they needed to do.
So when we look back at the Southwest African Campaign of 1914-15, it's tempting to see it simply as a colonial sideshow to the much larger struggles of the Western and Eastern fronts. But if you step back and view it through the lens of naval history, strategy, and global geopolitics, the picture changes entirely. This was not just a victory in the desert. It was a carefully orchestrated operation where sea power quietly but decisively shaped the outcome. At the heart of the campaign was a simple naval reality. As long as German Southwest Africa remained in enemy hands, the ports of Luderitz and Schwakopmund could serve as forward bases for German commerce raiders in the South Atlantic. These weren't theoretical concerns. In the early months of the war, German cruisers like the SMS Karlsruhe and SMS Dresden had roamed the seas, sinking Allied shipping and forcing the Royal Navy to divert precious resources to hunt them down. By capturing these ports and neutralizing the colony's wireless stations, the Union of South Africa, supported by British naval power, closed a dangerous gap in the empire's maritime defenses. The campaign also illustrated one of the oldest truths in military history. Armies march on their stomachs, but they sail on their supply ships. From the very first landings to the final push at Windhoek, the entire operation depended on the steady arrival of supplies from the seas. Naval transport ships carried ammunition, rations, fodder, medical equipment, and critically, water. Without that pipeline, the inland offensive would have stalled in the desert. The Royal Navy didn't need to fight a major fleet action off the coast to influence that campaign. Its control of the sea ensured the uninterrupted flow of men and material, an invisible yet decisive factor in victory. The Southwest African Campaign was more than a military success. It was a political statement. For the Union of South Africa, still a young dominion within the British Empire, the operation proved that it could conduct large-scale, independent military operations over vast distances. This boosted national pride among many South Africans, although it also deepened divisions, especially among those who had sympathized with Germany during the war. For Britain, the victory was a reminder of its global empire could still project power far beyond Europe, something that reassured allies and warned potential enemies alike. From a military history perspective, the campaign offers several enduring lessons. 1. Sea control enables land success. Without uncontested naval supremacy, the inland offensive would have been impossible. 2. Mobility over static defense. Botha's emphasis on converging mobile columns allowed him to outmaneuver the Germans, avoiding the costly attrition of trench warfare. 3. Logistics wins wars. The ability to sustain operations in hostile environments, far from home bases, often decides the outcome before the first shot is fired. And 4. Integrated operations. The seamless cooperation between naval transport, railway engineering, and mounted infantry became a model for later Allied campaigns in Africa and beyond. The surrender on July 9, 1915, marked the end of German colonial rule in Southwest Africa. In the post-war settlement, the League of Nations granted South Africa a mandate to administer the territory, a responsibility it would hold for decades, shaping the region's history well into the 20th century. It also marked the last time that German naval power in the South Atlantic posed a serious threat during the First World War. With their bases gone, their ships destroyed or bottled up, the southern seas became an Allied lake. The Southwest African campaign rarely makes the headlines in World War I histories. There are no iconic trench photographs, no massive casualty list, no epic naval battles to capture the imagination. And yet, in strategic terms, it was one of the most efficient Allied campaigns of the entire war. Planned with care, executed with speed, and achieved with comparatively low losses. It stands as a testament to the power of combined operations, where land and sea forces work in harmony towards a single, decisive goal.
I think one thing that caught my attention toward the end of the retelling of the campaign was how Frank, given the situation, surrendered at an appropriate time and saved the lives of thousands of his troops. And not just Germans, but the African auxiliaries. And this is something I would see a lot more when we were talking through the American Civil War campaigns. Like, they would lose one or two guys, and it's like, whoa, we value the lives of our soldiers. Let's surrender. And, hey, they can have this fort or this position or whatever. And I think Frank was of a similar mindset to a degree. Like, of course, he was trying to stymie the enemy at every turn and use hit-and-run tactics to kill the British and Dominion forces. But when he knew that he had lost, he didn't keep going just to destroy lives. You know what I mean? He stopped.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's significant. And that's something we don't necessarily see in other venues in World War I.
You got a guy who's actually woke.
Right. Well, he values life. How about that? That's awesome. And so, yeah, I think that was a huge victory for the British, and it could have been bogged down. Like, he could have forced them to imagine trying to dig trenches in the desert. You know, what would that have looked like? And
it wouldn't have looked like anything.
Yeah. Or some kind of defensive, like if he would have just blasted artillery, or maybe he didn't have the resources for such a thing. Anyway, this could have gone a lot of different ways, and I'm glad to know more about this portion of the overall conflict.
Okay, so we're going to end our episode by honoring one of our fallen angels with the help of HeroCards.us. Today, we're going to honor Zebulon Montgomery Pike, Brigadier General His hometown was Lamberton, New Jersey. Served with the U.S. Army. His date of sacrifice was April 27th, 1813. Killed in action in York, Canada. He was 34. Zebulon Montgomery Pike was born in Lamberton, now part of Trenton, New Jersey, during the American Revolution. As a son of a Continental Army officer, Pike spent parts of his childhood in and around frontier military posts. Eager to follow in his father's footsteps, Pike joined the Army at age 15. Serving under Revolutionary War hero General Mad Anthony Wayne, one of Pike's duties was to ferry supplies to forts located on the Miami, Ohio, and Mississippi rivers. These assignments gave him valuable experience in navigating rivers, negotiating with natives and frontier trading posts, and supplying armies. When the United States nearly doubled its size with the Louisiana Purchase, President Thomas Jefferson commissioned Meriwether Lewis and William Clark in 1804 to survey the northwestern portion of the vast wilderness. In 1805, General James Wilkinson, whom Jefferson appointed as governor of Louisiana, also wanted to sponsor an expedition. Zebulon Montgomery Pike, along with 20 other men and 4 months of provisions, was assigned the task of locating the source of the Mississippi River, thought to be somewhere in the newly acquired territory. In February of 1806, Pike's expedition came upon Leech Lake in northern Minnesota, which Pike incorrectly reported as the source of the Mississippi River. The actual source is Lake Itasca, located slightly to the west. A few months after his Mississippi River adventure, General Wilkinson assigned Pike to lead a second expedition into the southwestern portion of the new Louisiana Territory. The stated mission was for Pike to locate the sources of the Arkansas and Red Rivers. His assignment also included gathering information on the region's population, economy, geography, and military defenses. At the time, Spain was in control of major areas that would later become California, New Mexico, Texas, and Florida. Pike was instructed not to alarm the Spanish, as the relationship between the United States and Spain was uneasy after the Louisiana Purchase. Following a route from the Missouri and Osage rivers to the Arkansas River, Pike's expedition made diplomatic visits to Osage and Pawnee villages along the way, arriving at Front Range of the Rocky Mountains in November of 1806. Near present-day Pueblo, Colorado, the expedition came upon the tallest peak in the mountain range. They unsuccessfully attempted to scale the 14,115-foot mountain, encountering bad November weather. A second expedition 14 years later, by Major Stephen Long, would reach the top of the mountain, later named Pike's Peak. Heading south into the Spanish-controlled territory that is now the state of New Mexico, Pike's expedition aroused suspicion and was captured. Taken to Santa Fe and later to Chihuahua, Mexico, for questioning, Pike's papers were confiscated by the Spanish commander in the region. Pike later had to reconstruct his expedition's records from memory, and from a few notes he managed to smuggle out, hidden in gun barrels. His papers were eventually returned to the U.S. government 100 years later. After his release by the Spanish government, Pike rose through the military ranks. In 1811, he was given command of U.S. troops in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. By the time the U.S. had declared war against Great Britain in June of 1812, Pike had achieved the rank of colonel and was given command of the Army's 15th Regiment. In March of 1813, Mike was promoted to brigadier general. In April, he led 1,700 troops in a successful attack on Fort York, present-day Toronto, a major shipbuilding center for the British. The British commander, General Roger Hale Shaffel, was preparing to abandon the fort and retreat to Kingston, destroying military equipment to keep it out of the Americans' hands. With victory at hand, Pike halted his advance a few hundred feet away from the fort. As General Pike sat on a tree stump interrogating British prisoners, the fort's large ammunition storehouse exploded, hurtling debris that killed or wounded hundreds of American, British, and Canadian soldiers. Pike was struck by a huge rock that crushed his ribs and broke his back. Evacuated to the Navy schooner Madison, Pike lived long enough to hear the victory cheers as his men entered Fort York. One of his last requests was that the captured British flag be folded and placed beneath his head. Today, many towns, schools, and streets bear Zebulon Montgomery Pike's name, including the famous Pikes Peak and Pike National Forest in central Colorado. So, Brigadier General Zebulon Montgomery Pike, we thank you.
Thank you.
All right, get us out of here.
All right, man. So, number one, thank you so much for joining us today, helping us to learn a little bit more about World War I and how crucial and pivotal the Navy's participation is throughout. I'm learning a lot. I hope you are too. If there is something that caught your attention or some aspect, maybe you had a relative that fought in that campaign, let us know. You reach out and contact us. There's a couple of different ways to do that. One, you can email us at usnavyhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also hit us up on X Twitter. Our handle is at USNHistoryPod. And then additionally, we have a Discord you can join and participate. And I think I'm going to add a map of colonial Africa up on the Discord server so you can see the geographies associated with this conflict and potentially many more as we go through this World War I escapade. But yeah, join up and you can talk to us and others, and it's great. Finally, if you can rate and review us, that would help us. And then also tell a friend, family member, coworker about this podcast. And if they have an interest in history or the Navy or a combination, that's what we're here for. So thank you for listening, and we'll catch you next time.
And with that, we're going to wish you guys fair winds and following seas. Bye.
See ya.